Hey guys, June here, and just like I promised, we're now going to take another more in-depth look at Telos now that the mechanics are more fully understood. Step 1 for gearing up for Telos is obviously going to be to choose what attack style we're going to use, and Telos was designed very well in its balancing in the sense that all three attack styles are good choices and have various disadvantages and advantages that make them unique choices that suit different people's playstyles. With magic, you have the advantage of having the best style bonus for defense, which means that you're going to take slightly less damage from Telos' auto attacks, though this shouldn't actually influence kills that much. You have the option of using blood spells, which offer you a healing ability, or if you're using normal magic spells instead, you can use debuffs, and that could include things like the Gothic Staff special as well, as that's a debuff. Magic has some nice AoE abilities for dealing with the Golem minions on phases 4 and 5, and Asphyxiate is a really nice ability for stalling his attack rotation, which is going to be very important at one particular situation on phase 4. The only real disadvantage with magic is that you can't use the spell Disruption Shield since it's on the Lunar spellbook. This spell can be used to interrupt basically any of Telos' special attacks, which can be convenient. However, there are other ways to deal with all of them, and so magic has rapidly become the choice for the advanced PVMers who are doing very high Enrage kills. Melee is another common choice. Melee has access to the Vampirism Scrimshaw, which replaces the effects of blood spells and offers even better healing than they do, as well as having good AoE DPS for the minions on phase 4 and 5 just like magic does. Melee also has the natural DPS advantage simply because the damage boost from Berserk is stronger, and you also have access to Disruption Shield, which makes dealing with some of the special attacks a little bit easier. The major drawback here is standard for Melee, which is that you're unable to attack from a distance, which is not important for most of the fight, but it can cause some problems on phase 5 where you'll be running around a bit frantically doing a few different tasks. As such, this is a great choice if you're learning or you're doing moderate Enrage kills, anywhere from 0 to maybe in the 300 range. Lastly is ranged, which honestly gets undersold here. Telos is both stunnable and bindable, which means that you can utilize stun DPS combos to deal some incredible DPS that completely outclasses both magic and melee. The only real drawback to this is that after 150% Enrage, Telos begins to use the ability Freedom to clear stuns and binds periodically, which means that ranged basically loses its only advantage. Because of this, ranged might be a great choice for doing speed kills in the 100 to 150% Enrage range if you want to be a record setter, but other than that, this is not a common choice. With all that in mind, here is a rough look at what a common loadout might look like. For lower Enrage kills, you may want to supplement this with power armor, but keep in mind that as the Enrage increases, you're definitely going to want to start defaulting to your Acto. Those defensive resets are going to come in very handy. Your inventory should include all the common things, especially a shield switch and ideally a defender if you have a tier 90 defender. On drastically high Enrages, some people have simply gone without offhands and shields completely and just defaulted to the defender for the entire kill. The only two unusual things to keep in mind when gearing up for Telos is that you definitely want Weapon Poison because he is uniquely susceptible to it, and you want to bring Dread Nymphs because since he is stunnable and bindable, they will continue to stall his attack rotation very similar to the way that they did with all bosses before the nerf. For a familiar, on low Enrages either a Nile or a Yak will work fine, but on higher Enrages you definitely need a Yak and you'll want to fill it with the dicest food that you can afford. One interesting thing I've learned about Telos since I made the previous video is that all of his attack rotations are extremely predictable. Not only does he use the same specials in the same order on each individual phase, but you can predict what the first special on the next phase will be based on what the last one on the previous phase was. I personally like to think of him as having 5 different special attack slots on each particular phase. On phase 1 he only actually has 3 special attacks, so he would simply skip slot 2 and 4 and do the first, third, fifth special attack and then repeat that cycle forever. Then however, if the last special attack on phase 1 was the first special attack slot, the first special attack on phase 2 would be the second slot. Conversely, if the last special attack on phase 2 was in the first slot, since phase 3 doesn't have a second slot special attack, it would default to the third special attack slot, which is the Red Virus. No doubt this seems a bit confusing, and it can be difficult to explain, but I think once you guys have attempted a few kills, you'll start to notice the pattern. Keep in mind the exception to this is phase 5, which always starts off with the golems and proceeds in the same order. So, now that we know how to actually predict which of Telos' special attacks is going to be coming next, let's look at how we can mitigate each individual one. The very first special you'll encounter is the Bind and Heal, where the player gets bound in place and their HP and adrenaline are drained, healing Telos over time. This is a channeled attack for Telos, so you can soul split while this is happening, and you can use Debilitate ahead of time to reduce the amount of damage that you take for the duration. You simply need to deal damage to Telos to free yourself, so plan ahead for this and have a couple of thresholds available. For the next special attack, Telos will crouch and say, Gielinor, give me strength, and shortly after do this surging uppercut sort of thing that deals very high typeless damage to the player. This can be blocked with Resonance, or Disruption Shield, or Barricade. You can reduce the damage by using Debilitate or Reflect, but the best way to deal with this attack is by using either Surge or Escape, specifically on the tick where the attack is firing, to avoid all damage. Simply running away is not sufficient for avoiding this special attack, and although the margin for error on avoiding this, the timing is tiny, it's an important skill to get used to because you'll actually need all of the other abilities that you could block this for other special attacks. For the last special on phase 1, he says hold still to the player and strikes them with melee damage that hits very highly and also stuns. Shortly after, he jumps on that location and deals high typeless damage if the player hasn't moved away. The ideal thing to do here is, since we can anticipate when this is coming based on his attack rotation, use an ability like Anticipation or Freedom to make sure that we're not going to be stunned by that, and Resonance from the high melee hit. This basically removes the need for food, and then we can simply move to avoid the jump attack. Meanwhile, on phase 1, there will occasionally be green beams spawned across the arena. If the player stands inside these beams, it drains their prayer points but increases their adrenaline incrementally over time, and so is a great way to boost your DPS. If the beams are allowed to hit Telos, it instead increases the gauge at the top of his screen, and if that's filled, the next time he is intended to do one of the special attacks from his attack rotation, he instead says so much power and releases a ball of anima at the player, which deals very high typeless damage. You can block this with Barricade, Resonance, or Disruption Shield, or reduce the damage from it using things like Debilitate and Reflect. As you can see from this clip, I missed my Resonance switch and was a little bit too slow, and that is a painful amount of damage. Because of this, your primary focus should always be to either be blocking the beams from hitting Telos or keeping him out of them. After he does the so much power special, he will resume his normal special attack rotation exactly where he left off. Telos will continue to rotate between these special attacks on phase 1 with a certain number of auto attacks between each one based on your Enrage level. Keep in mind his primary method of attack on this phase is melee, so keep your deflect prayers up and DPS until phase 2 starts. On phase 2, the first obvious change is that the intermittent beams that cross the arena have changed to black, and they have a different effect. If the player is standing in them, they'll both take and deal decreased damage. If Telos is standing in it, it will also charge the gauge at the top of the screen, but he loses the special attack from phase 1 and will no longer do the so much power special. Instead, that bar is used for one of his other special attacks on this phase that I'll talk about in a moment. So Telos has gained 2 new special attacks on this phase. The first is what's called a Black Virus, which is a 30-second long debuff applied to the player. This effect just deals incremental damage over time to the player until they stand inside the black beam, which clears this effect. The other special attack is the one that utilizes the gauge at the top of the screen, and I like to affectionately refer to this as the Mage Rape phase. Normally throughout this phase, Telos is using melee, but during this portion of his special attack rotation he switches to exclusively using magic and also becomes completely immobile. Every one of these magic attacks reduces a little bit of the energy from the gauge at the top of the screen. However, because each of the black beams is also going to spawn on his location, the player needs to block them to prevent them from refilling them. These magic attacks have an amazingly wide range of damage, and on high enrages especially can definitely one-hit KO the player. During this part of the phase, make sure you swap to your magic prayer and utilize defenses like Debilitate and Devotion, and if you're on a higher enrage you may even need to do a shield switch and use things like Barricade and Immortality to deal with this as well. Telos will continue to cycle those same 5 special attacks in the order of the Hold, the Black Virus, the Gielinor Uppercut thing, the Bind and Heal, and the Mage Rape phase until you've depleted his HP and pushed him into phase 3. On phase 3, the gauge at the top has been replaced with a really nasty balancing mechanic. Without a doubt, this is where most people struggle most with the Telos fight. First off, Telos has switched to primarily using magic on this phase, so make sure you switch your prayer appropriately. The beams on this phase have turned to red, and while the player is standing inside them, they both deal and take increased damage. Telos will also periodically summon golems, which the player can temporarily disable, or, if they're using weapon poison, can actually kill, though that may be an unintended mechanic. While the golems are alive, they'll push Telos' bar to the right, and anytime Telos is standing inside the red beam, he will also be pushed to the right on his balance mechanic. Disabling the golems, or the player standing inside the red beam, will push it to the left. On each side is a red zone, and any time the bar is inside that red zone, the player is subject to one of two mechanics. On the left side, they'll have their adrenaline drained, which is not all that inconvenient. On the right side, Telos turns into a walking nuke, and that should be avoided at all costs. The most important thing to remember on this phase is that while it's important that Telos is not in the beam, the player doesn't always need to be in the beam. As long as Telos isn't standing inside of it, your number one goal should be dealing with the golems and making sure they're not pushing his bar too far to the right. Aside from that, Telos only uses 3 special attacks on this phase. There is a red virus, which is just an exact copy of the black virus from the previous phase that's cleared by standing in the red beam. The order of the specials here is the hold, the red virus, and then the Gillinor uppercut. Continue going through these motions until you've depleted his HP and he moves into phase 4. There's lots of new things going on phase 4, starting with a brand new special attack. This occurs when Telos says, "Let the anima consume you," and fires an orb at the player. When it strikes, it deals pretty high typeless damage and also adds a damage over time effect. This effect has both typeless damage as well as an overload draining effect until the player clears it by standing on any one of the 3 fonts in the arena. Damage from this can be blocked or reduced in all the usual ways, but in my opinion the best thing to do here is a resonance switch, and instead of using our resonance on the hold special, we'll just be using devotion and melee prayer. This anima ball becomes one of the 3 special attacks that Telos uses on this phase in the order of the Gillinor uppercut, the anima ball, and then the hold. The second part of the mechanic on this phase is that after you deplete each of the 25% increments of his HP, he's going to summon one of each of 3 types of stone golems. During this time, Telos also charges an instant kill attack, which can be blocked by using the font to protect yourself. However, that steals HP from you during this charge process. Ideally, you want to use something like Barricade or Reflect to reduce the amount of damage that you're taking from charging up the font while you're dealing with the golems. Keep in mind that each of the golems also has a passive effect. The Volcanic Golem can stun the player, and does so very frequently. The Corrupt Golem reduces the effectiveness of the player's armor, and the Pure Golem increases its damage over time. Finally, on top of all of this, during this same period, Telos is charging his special attack bar at the top of the screen, and when that's full, he will use the same So Much Power special that he used on phase 1. This can be seriously problematic because the instant kill attack will put all of your defensive abilities on cooldown, and so if he uses the So Much Power special while they're still on cooldown, you're likely to get killed in one hit on higher Enrage levels. There are 2 effective ways to deal with this. First off, if there are golems left alive, you can use Preparation to bring Resonance off cooldown faster so that you can block it with Resonance. The other more reliable method is to use Asphyxiate on Telos as soon as the instant kill attack is fired. This stalls his attack rotation long enough for your defenses to come off cooldown so you can resonance it or reduce the damage with other defensive abilities. This same pattern of spawning golems, charging an instant kill attack, charging the font, and protecting yourself occurs 3 times, and finally after the 3rd time, when you defeat Telos, you finish phase 4, and if you're at sub 100% Enrage, the kill is over. However, for those of us over 100% Enrage, we move on to phase 5. As we move into phase 5, one thing that's important to remember is where each of the fonts is located and what type they correspond to. The very first font that we blocked at was the Pure font, the second was the Volcanic font, and the third was the Corrupt font. On spawn, make sure we swap our prayer back to magic. Since Telos is anchored, he's going to be maging us throughout this entire phase, and he also summons 6 golems of one of the 3 types. We need to lure them to their respective fonts and kill them to charge the font, at which point it will begin levitating and circling in the way that it did previously. Reflect and Revenge are great for increasing our DPS against the golems and reducing the amount of damage that we take, and towards the end of the process of killing them we're likely going to get our virus, which is going to be of a random color of the 3 beams. When your Reflect is worn off, that's an opportune time to use Barricade. The damage from the bleed is pretty significant, especially on higher Enrages, and there's likely to occasionally be some golems left over, so the damage from all of those can add up very significantly. After we clear the bleed in the respective beam, we can DPS Telos until it says that he's charging his bomb. At that point we want to go tag the font that we restored earlier, and we get a short opportunity to DPS Telos again while he's stunned. Remember to use the beams to assist your DPS, and then that whole cycle will repeat until we're able to kill Telos. On top of all of this other stuff, there's also a ceiling fall mechanic that's indicated by some rocks falling on the spot, and then a 3x3 area around there gets hit with pretty high typeless damage. This is pretty easy to avoid, but when you're juggling this on top of all the other mechanics that are going on, it can be pretty easy to get KO'd from that. One nice trick to keep in mind, if for any reason you're not able to charge the font properly, if you're not close enough when you kill the golems for example, or if you're just trying to brute force your way through this phase on lower Enrage levels, Immortality will protect you from the instant kill mechanic on this phase. Without a defensive reset, it won't be available to protect you from 2 in succession, but if the HP on the phase is low because your Enrage is low, you can just run straight for the yellow beam and onslaught. That will of course give you some incredible DPS, and the fact that it boosts your adrenaline back up will mean that if for some reason you're not able to kill it before the instant kill mechanic, you'll be able to do a shield switch and Immortality to protect yourself. The slow and steady way that I described earlier is much better if you're trying to actually learn how to do this boss properly and aim for doing it on high Enrage kills, but if for example you're just aiming to get the trim requirement done and you really struggle with this boss, that is an easy way to brute force your way through this phase. So hopefully this guide gave you everything that you need to really fully understand Telos' mechanics, and hopefully as a result get much better at it and maybe push yourself to a much higher Enrage than you expected. I do want to just add a short disclaimer that obviously the Enrage influences the mechanics. For example, below 50% neither of the virus special attacks are included in Telos' special attack rotation, the ability for him to use freedom after 150%, and all of the other changes that I talked about. This probably means there are a bunch more mechanics that are unlocked at higher Enrage levels, though I expect they don't influence the fight too much. I will update them in the description as those sorts of things are discovered, but obviously the highest known Enrage kill at the time is like 650%, and it goes all the way up to 4000%, and I expect that the JMods included content all the way up to 4000. I will start a list in the description now of all of the changes to the mechanics and what Enrage level they're unlocked at, and I'll try my best to keep that updated as new things are discovered as people push to higher and higher Enrage levels. I hope this video was useful. As always, thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next video.